November tahun 1396. A fortress in the frozen heart of France. Inside a stone chamber where candlelight trembled against walls that had witnessed centuries of ritual and blood, a 12-year-old girl stood perfectly still while women dressed her in white. Her name was Isabel of Valois, daughter of Charles VI of France, and in less than an hour she would become Queen of England. But this was no fairy tale. What awaited her beyond that heavy oak door was something history would spend 6 centuries trying to forget. A ceremony so dark, so methodically cruel, that even the men who recorded it could barely find words to describe what they had witnessed. This is the story of a wedding night that lasted 7 days, 7 nights of ritual, 7 nights of witnesses, 7 nights that would break a child and bind 2 kingdoms in a treaty written not in ink, but in suffering. The women worked in silence, their prayers merging into a low hum that Isabel could barely hear over the pounding of her own heart. They brushed her pale hair until it shone like spun glass in the firelight. They draped her in linens perfumed with lavender and myrrh, fabrics too heavy for her slight shoulders, pressing down like an invisible weight she would carry forever. When they lowered the veil over her face, she no longer looked like a child. She looked like an offering. Outside, November wind clawed at the arrow slits, desperate and cold, as if trying to warn her of what was coming. But there would be no escape, not for her, not for any girl born into the machinery of medieval power. Downstairs in the great hall, her husband waited, King Richard II of England, 29 years old, hollowed by grief. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died young, and the loss had carved something permanent from his soul. England had mourned with him, its bells tolling not just for her death, but for the death of his youth, his hope, his humanity. But kings are not allowed to mourn forever. Peace demanded more than sorrow could offer. And so between England and France, between 2 kingdoms exhausted by decades of bloodshed, a new accord was forged, not signed in ink, sealed in flesh. Isabel was the price, a living treaty, a child traded for a ceasefire that both nations desperately needed. But to make that promise unbreakable, to ensure no rival could question the legitimacy of the union, the marriage had to be verified, witnessed, documented beyond any shadow of doubt, not for 1 night, but for 7. 7 nights of observation, 7 nights of intrusion, 7 nights of what they called consummation, performed not in privacy but as ritual, as evidence, as proof that the alliance was real. This was no wedding, this was sanctified captivity. The cold arithmetic of medieval politics laid bare. A world where a young girl's body became a legal document, and her pain became the signature that bound nations together. Every detail you are about to hear comes from real records, royal ledgers, medical accounts, clerical chronicles preserved for over 6 centuries. These are not metaphors. This is the language of bureaucracy recording cruelty as procedure. What happened to Isabel of Valois was not considered a crime in her world. It was custom, it was law. It was blessed by the church and commanded by crowns. They called it the extended bedding, the 7-day verification, a ritual designed to erase all doubt by erasing humanity itself. And as the women finished dressing her, as they stepped back to admire their work with tears in their eyes, Isabel understood in the way only children can that her life as she knew it was ending. The girl she had been that morning would not survive the week ahead. If stories like this one matter to you, if you believe the forgotten voices of history deserve to be heard, please consider subscribing. These are the stories they didn't teach us in school, the ones too dark, too uncomfortable, too human. But they are real, and they are worth remembering. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and what stories from the shadows of history you want us to uncover next. The ritual they forced upon her was called the prolonged bedding, and it was older than any treaty, older than the kingdoms themselves. Among medieval nobility, marriage was never about love. It was a weapon, a tool for forging alliances and securing dynasties through the promise of heirs. But when the bride was royal, when peace itself depended on her body, when rival courts or the church might later question the union's validity, they needed more than promises. They needed proof, medical proof, witnessed proof. Proof that could be recorded, signed, and sealed into the archives as evidence that could never be disputed. And so for 7 days and 7 nights, Isabel of Valois became not a wife, but a living experiment in the intersection of politics, religion, and medieval medicine. Physicians from the French court documented everything. Their records still exist, written in detached Latin, clinical and precise as autopsy reports. They described her temperament, her humors, her physical reactions as though she were a specimen rather than a child. Guards stood outside the chamber door in shifts that never ended. Clergymen and nobles entered at scheduled hours to observe and confirm. Servants delivered meals twice daily according to astrological charts, because medieval doctors believed the moon governed fertility and that conception required precise timing. Between each session, physicians examined Isabel for what they called signs of fulfillment, checking her pulse, her color, her tears, writing notes that were countersigned by witnesses and bound into the treaty documents as proof that the union had been properly completed. They were not voyeurs, they told themselves. They were bureaucrats. They were servants of order. They were doing their duty to 2 kingdoms that desperately needed this marriage to succeed. But for Isabel, locked in that chamber with no escape, no privacy, no moment of mercy, this was not order. This was the slow unraveling of everything she was. The air thick with incense and candle smoke, voices outside the door speaking in languages she barely understood, deciding what her body must endure in the name of peace. When she cried, they called it the natural fear of womanhood. When she trembled, they labeled it reaction and wrote it in their notes. When she bled, they called it proof and praised God that the alliance was secure. Medieval medicine taught that a woman had to experience pleasure for conception to occur, that her body had to release its own seed in response to the man's desire. And so they watched for signs of arousal, measured her breathing, checked her skin for flush, documenting everything as if her suffering were a scientific process rather than a prolonged violation sanctioned by church and state. The Latin phrase appears again and again in the records, cold and final. Testificatum est unio perfecta. It is testified the union is complete. Diplomats sent letters home to Paris throughout the week, preserved in archives to this day, written in calm, measured tones that make your skin crawl. They mention that the marriage was properly concluded according to custom, that every measure had been observed as required by both crowns. No word of the child, no mention of her pain, only assurance that the treaty stood secure. Because in their world, Isabel was not a person. She was a signature. She was proof. She was the ground upon which two kingdoms built their fragile peace. When the seventh day finally ended, Isabel emerged from that chamber pale as death itself. Her attendants said she barely spoke above a whisper for weeks afterward, her eyes hollow, her hands shaking whenever anyone came too close. She had survived, though what part of her survived was uncertain. And despite everything, despite all the rituals and examinations and physicians' notes confirming fulfillment, Isabel did not conceive. Her body was too young, her womb unready for what they had demanded of it. The doctors blamed the timing. They blamed her diet. They blamed the alignment of planets. They never blamed the ritual itself. They never questioned whether what they had done was monstrous. King Richard withdrew from her almost entirely after that week, granting her chambers and jewels and attendance but never summoning her again. Some historians believe guilt consumed him. Others say disgust. Whatever the truth, he treated her afterward not as a wife but as a symbol, too fragile to touch, too damaged to love. When he was deposed in 1399 and died shortly after in prison, Isabel was barely 13 years old, widowed before she reached womanhood, used up before she could become herself. She was eventually returned to France and married again at 16, this time to a man closer to her own age. In that second marriage she bore children, rediscovered laughter, learned to live again. But those who knew her said she carried a silence that never lifted, the stillness of someone who had once been turned into evidence. She died at 20, her body worn out, her spirit already gone. They painted her afterward as a saint, serene and gentle, surrounded by angels and stained glass. They made her beautiful again, as if art could atone for what history had done. But the girl who stood in that chamber in 1396 is still there, frozen in time, waiting for someone to remember. Her not as a symbol of peace, but as a child who deserved better than the world she was born into. What they did to Isabelle of Valois was not unique. It was custom, it was law. It was how civilization built itself, not on progress but on endurance, not on mercy but on silence. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all. That such cruelty could be called holy. That such suffering could be called duty. That a child could be sacrificed and the world could call it peace. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Should stories like Isabel's be remembered, or are some histories too dark to revisit? We want to hear your thoughts.